So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sarah. Sarah is an animal welfare field manager at 𝗦𝗿𝗵, and she's spent nearly 15 years in animal management of various kinds, including in zoos, in rescue centres, and also within the wildlife tourism industry. Sarah's got lots of experience both in the UK and abroad as well. Her role at the moment with 𝗦𝗿𝗵 includes creating animal welfare resources, conducting global training workshops, and really driving forwards improvements in welfare for captive animals. She really particularly enjoys working directly with the animal care staff and recognising that actually collaboration is really key, and that big changes are going to start with baby steps. So Sarah today is going to be talking about animal care and animal welfare and thinking about what the difference is in these concepts and helping you to understand the nuances of these and then actually how we apply it in practice. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for that introduction, Ellen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's all fine. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's get into it. So back in my zookeeper days, I always assumed that animal care and animal welfare were pretty much the same thing. And it'd be interesting to see whether other people have thought that before as well. But the more that I've learned along the way, particularly about welfare itself, the more that I've understood the importance of recognizing the nuances between these two concepts. So that's what we are going to explore today. So just before we dive into care and welfare, what's the difference? Just a little bit about 𝗦𝗿𝗵, who we are and what we do. If anyone does want to find out a little bit more about us, then they can scan that QR code in the middle of the screen. But in a nutshell, our vision is a world where every captive wild animal is able to thrive and live a good life. And we achieve that in a number of different ways. We provide practical support to facilities all the way around the world. That could be zoos, aquariums, rescue centres, sanctuaries, anything like that. And we work to bring welfare to the forefront of all decisions made. And it's a really, really important aspect to what we do. And because we know that if people are able to view their management practices through the lens of welfare, then we can have a really significant impact on animals under human care. And as Ellen mentioned earlier, we very much work to build positive, constructive and collaborative relationships. Condemnation is not going to get us anywhere, and collaboration is key. So we really do work to build these relationships where we are solution seeking together and everybody is really happy to talk through everything together as a team. We do provide a range of resources, one of which I will briefly mention at the end, but do check out our website for all of those. And we work towards long-term sustainable change, and that is very much about the humans that look after animals. So we want to achieve change that continues to happen long after we have left the facility or indeed the country, and the way that we do that is through the animal care staff themselves. We do provide workshops and training, both theoretically and practically, both virtually and in country. So the term animal welfare has been notoriously difficult to define, but it's essentially referring to the well-being of an animal. Now, it was 𝗦𝗿𝗵 who said that in the way in which we view welfare greatly impacts the way in which we treat animals and therefore the conditions that we provide for them. So to learn more about what animal welfare meant to keepers, I asked a few what their definitions of what animal welfare meant to them. And it was really interesting, a little exercise to conduct, because you can see the massive variety in these definitions. We've got the 5 freedoms mentioned in there. We've got specific elements of welfare talked about, but everyone's understanding of what welfare means to them is quite different. Now, at 𝗦𝗿𝗵, we tend to emphasize the use of the word coping, understanding how an animal is coping with its environment, both physically and mentally. And we can see from this definition, and I do apologize that it isn't the shortest definition in the world, that we can see that written about animal care and welfare concepts. So welfare concerns the state of the animal, not the husbandry practices used to manage the animal or the care it receives. So we can see that they do feed into each other, but understanding of one does not guarantee an accurate perception of the other. Now, when we look at animal welfare models, historically, as I'm sure we all know, we had the 5 freedoms, which were developed in the 60s primarily for farm animals. And we now have a much more up-to-date model known as the 5 domains. Now, when I was at university, I was actually taught the 5 freedoms because the 5 domains hadn't been implemented yet. So I graduated in 2010, and this came about in 2014. And what was really interesting, though, was that even throughout my career, as I was still continuing to research and read journal papers and things like that, I never came across the 5 domains. And that's been the case for a lot of other keepers, particularly of my age range, that I've spoken to as well. And it really does go to show as well how quickly animal welfare as a science is changing and evolving. I always say animal welfare is about as old as I am, make of that what you will. But you can see that it is very much changing, and we do have to work hard to keep up with everything that is new. Now, on the right here, you can see a very simplified version of the 5 domains model. It's something I put together basically for myself because I'm quite a visual learner. Now, it is a very simplified version, but it does just help to show how everything interacts with each other, how those 4 physical domains feed into that 5th domain of the mental state. But here we've got a much more accurate and much busier version of it. And it really helps to highlight, this version helps to highlight the differences between the 2 models. So whilst with the 5 freedoms, that concentrates more on reducing negative experiences, the 5 domains is also highlighting the importance of promoting positive experiences as well as reducing those negative. And if we as animal care staff can shift our way of thinking towards that, instead of problem solving just against the negative, then our care practices will really become much more efficient at prioritizing welfare as a whole. So a more recent addition, just for anyone who doesn't know, to the behaviour domain was an amendment paper that 𝗕lle and his team authored in 2020. Now, this domain originally focused on animal behaviour, and that was the behaviour of the animal itself, and then also animal interactions between that animal and other animals surrounding it, particularly if it's a social species. But this paper was actually highlighting the importance of recognising human-animal interactions and the roles that these interactions can play within overall welfare. And as I'm sure we all know, these can be very positive, they can be very negative, or they can be some way in between. But we can't discredit them from the overall impact on animal welfare and individual life experiences. And within this paper, there were a few quite interesting comments. So first of all, asking whether an animal has agency over this human-animal interaction. Are they being forced into the interaction? Do they choose it? Do they have the option to move away from it if they want to? Are they even being bribed to be there? And then the paper also discusses our own behaviour and relationship with that animal. Obviously, depending on that relationship, it could be very positive or very negative. I've unfortunately seen quite a lot of very negative relationships between humans and animals, but we can certainly see the positives out there as well. And actually, at the EAZA Welfare Forum a couple of months ago, there was a really interesting video that showed a keeper who sadly did struggle with a negative association with a tiger under their care, but actually through behavioural management, they managed to build on that relationship, and it's a much more positive experience for both keeper and animal now. So it can always be changed if we want it to be. I would encourage you all to go and have a little look at that paper because there's some really interesting graphs in there to show the sliding scales between positive, negative and neutral, and lots of different scenarios in there of what human-animal interactions might look like. And then there was one other aspect within this paper that really stuck with me, and that was bondage humans whose actions cause unintended harm. Now, I'm sure we have all been in this situation where we have a very strong personal relationship, and usually it's very positive, with an animal, and maybe it's time for a euthanasia decision, and we are putting that off because we have this very strong bond, but actually that is increasing the likelihood of the animal suffering. So again, our interactions don't even necessarily need to be physical. They can just be a decision, but it will be dependent on our relationship with the animal sometimes, and we do need to make sure that we are prioritizing welfare in that decision process. So that's been looking at some of the welfare models that we can potentially utilize. Now, looking at animal care and welfare as 2 different concepts. Historically, determining the welfare status of individual animals has largely focused on what is animal care, and that's what is provided to the animals. So all of these provisions are very necessary components of welfare, but they do not in and of themselves ensure good welfare. And it's when we start to understand this that we can really objectively drive forward animal welfare improvements through our husbandry and management practices. And best practice animal care is about ensuring that animals are thriving, not just surviving. And the more that we know and understand about what animal welfare is, the more that we can achieve that through the care that we provide. So in comparison to welfare, when we think about animal care, then we can think about it as a sort of operating system. So from enrichment routine to proactive healthcare to breeding and food choice, we control all aspects of an animal's life. And this control is what we put in, the input into a system of care. And this control is also how we process the care. So for example, we input food and water, but the process describes how we apply that input, so where, when, and how we place the food and water in that enclosure. And we refer to this as primary care. Now, how an animal responds and how we record that response is actually what comes out, the output of that system of care. And sometimes I even like to look at this backwards. So you can actually look at what output you think that you might want to see. So for example, if you want to encourage foraging behaviors in an animal that you know spends 70% of its time foraging, then you can look at, this is the output that I want. How am I going to change my input to achieve that output? So for years as a zookeeper, I thought that because I was striving to give the best care possible to my animals, that they automatically experienced a good level of welfare. And in my head, as long as my animals were clean, they were fed, they were healthy, and they were acting relatively normally, then they were clearly happy, healthy, and thriving. And the more that I've learned about welfare, the more that I've looked back on all of this and actually realized that welfare is obviously impacted by our care practices, but looking deeper to understand how an animal is feeling and coping with the care that we provide can really help to drive where we might want to take those care practices in terms of meeting an animal's needs rather than meeting a keeper's needs. So good animal care is providing opportunities for comfort, for pleasure, for interest. It's allowing for environmental choice that promotes positive welfare. And it's providing an animal with control over its environment. So as keepers, we have this duty of care towards our animals, but we might be mistaking that for welfare itself. And that's certainly what I was doing back when I was a keeper. And it's also something that I've been thinking about more recently. What is rewarded in terms of being a keeper? So when you're a keeper, you're often rewarded. Say if you're scrubbing a water within an inch of its life, then you are, in a way, that cleaning is proving yourself to your managers. It's showing your passion for the animals and that kind of thing. But actually that is essentially meeting our needs rather than the animal's needs. And we can look at that example of hyper-clean enclosures in the next slide. But certainly if we're thinking about as managers, what we might be looking out for, we really should be looking for keepers who are able to improve the animal's welfare, and we should be rewarding that in that which we're seeing. So let's take a look at some lessons learned from the past. So as I mentioned, hyper-clean enclosures is one example that I've got. So examples like hyper-clean enclosures back in the disinfectant era, back in the day, they might mean less chance of disease, which is fantastic, but how does it impact the sensory experiences and the behavioral opportunities of those animals? So for example, if you've got a species, say a big cat, which is very strong on olfaction, if we are shutting that animal into an enclosure that actually stinks of bleach, even if we've washed it away and we can't really smell it that much, the big cat in question still might be able to smell it very much, and they might not even be able to get away from that smell if they want to. So thinking about the sensory experiences in terms of olfaction or acoustics, if we've got tiled and concrete walled enclosures, which are very easy to clean, so fantastic for us, but actually if you've got maybe bats, for example, who might have trouble echolocating because of the bouncing of that sound off those surfaces. And then if we're looking at communication, so you might take callitrichids, for example, if we are scrubbing away scent trails every single day, then again, that might actually be quite a stressful experience for those callitrichids in question. And that's something that, again, I was asked to do in my keeping role because that in my head, I had to clean. That was exactly what I should be doing as part of my care. But when we think about the welfare of those callitrichids, we think that we're providing the best care via cleaning, but actually the welfare might mean that we might want to leave some of those scent trails so the callitrichid species can still navigate and talk to each other. And then behaviors. So again, these tiled enclosures, you can see this one in the picture here that I used to work in. This was great to keep nice and clean. You can see that that's just been cleaned actually, but that bear doesn't have any opportunity to dig, which it feels very motivated to do. So again, these hyper-clean enclosures, yes, they might be easy to clean and they might be very good at terms of keeping things hygienic, but they aren't giving the animals the welfare opportunities that they need, and we're not able to see those welfare outcomes. Now, this next one, it's a slightly awkward question. You don't have to answer it, but just have a little think on it for me. Covering up the problem, how many of you have been told to place branches or other obstacles over the pathway of stereotypic pacing? I'm going to put my hand up and say, absolutely, I've been asked to do that. And some of you might well have been asked to do that as well. Now, this isn't addressing the why of the problem. It's just introducing a potential management change, a potential way in which we might change the way in which we care for that animal. But good welfare is ensuring that we question and act on where the frustration which is evidently causing that pacing behaviour is coming from, because as we all know, behaviour is always meaningful. And the more that we are open and accepting and reacting to that, the better that an animal's welfare can be, as long as we are making changes based on what the animal is telling us rather than what we think we need to do. And there can sometimes be this line of thought that conservation is equal to or greater than welfare. And there might be an assumption that if a facility is undertaking fantastic conservation work, then the animals in that facility must, again, automatically experience a good standard of welfare. But we need to be seeing conservation and welfare as two very different things. And we also need to be promoting them very separately as well. And that's something you can get your marketing teams involved with. And when we're thinking about welfare and conservation, welfare isn't guaranteed through conservation credentials because they are very different things. And I do notice in a lot of zoo manifestos that you've got conservation, education, research, which is all fantastic, but is welfare being left off because it's being assumed? Are we just assuming that the animals are having good welfare? Do we need to look into that a little bit more and make sure that we're not assuming or that we're not confusing it for a different aspect? So even if a facility is doing amazing conservation projects out in situ, it might be a different story for the animals within that facility ex situ. So we do need to see the conservation and welfare as these two very separate concepts. Now we're going to try something, hopefully this is going to work. So this is our first poll for you all to get involved with. If it doesn't work, then just pop your answer in the chat. But a little question for you all. Do you think that longevity and breeding are accurate measures of welfare? So Ellen might hopefully be able to put this in the poll, but if that doesn't work, then just pop your answers in the chat for me. But we're just looking at this old assumption that longevity and breeding are accurate welfare measures. Do we think that they are, or do we think that they are not? Okay, so we've got the poll up, so do feel free to put your answers in there. And already we're getting, okay, that's interesting. We're getting quite a lot of no's, but we are getting a few yeses and we're getting a few unknown. And this isn't a question to catch you out. This is definitely very much in the past what we have assumed to be the case. If an animal is living for a long time and if it is breeding, then automatically its welfare must be good, right? Now, again, this is a lesson learned from the past, and we can question whether this is really the case. Now, interestingly, we've got about 74% saying no, about 20% saying yes, and about 6% saying unknown. So I think a lot of people are thinking no, which is fantastic. I'll just click off that now. It's great that a lot of people are saying no, because that is the correct answer essentially. But it is something that used to be thought about a lot in the past. I want to give an example that really might make you think about how longevity in particular is not an accurate welfare measure. So if we take a look, if it's going to do it. There we go. If we take a look at bare bile farm bears, and if you guys don't know much about bare bile farming, do go and Google it, but have the tissues ready. But basically, bare bile farming is bears that are being kept in this kind of cage throughout their whole lives. And the thing about these guys is that they can live like this for maybe upwards of about 20 years. So their longevity is there. They are able to live to potentially, if they're able to live maybe up towards 30, then they are able to get to that average life expectancy. But we know that they're not experiencing a good level of welfare. They're simply surviving in this kind of environment, but they're certainly not able to thrive. They're just existing on the very basic level of care that's provided, but they're never able to truly experience positive emotions or good welfare. And this is obviously a really extreme example, but it's one which really does highlight the issues with using longevity as a welfare measure. So instead, we might be looking at quality of life rather than longevity to really understand the level of welfare that animal care is providing. And the more that we can shift our thinking towards that, then hopefully the more that we are able to create those positive changes. And then going back to breeding for a second, there are sometimes incidences, so I've met macaques in similar setups to this, and they were breeding. And sometimes it is the case that the animals are breeding because there's nothing else to do. So breeding, again, isn't always an accurate welfare measure either. Now, I'm going to go through all four domains as individual, all four physical domains, sorry, as individuals, just to explore them a little bit further. So let's take nutrition as the first example. So if we've got a giraffe and we're feeding him browser pellet, that is giving him all the nutritional components that he needs. But as we know with nutrition, there's much more to it than that. So I want you guys to think about if you ate the same nutritionally balanced meal every single day for the rest of your life, even if it provided you with all the nutrients that you needed, even if it was your favorite food in the whole world, say that pizza provided you with everything that you needed, if you still had to eat only that every single day for the rest of your life, it would get very, very boring. Because food is so much more than just nutrition. It's experiencing different tastes, different textures, and really importantly, the natural behaviors which go into obtaining it. So going back to our giraffe, we could give him browser pellet and one species of browse. Perfect. He's able to strip those leaves off. He's able to experience a bit of choice, and he's able to get different nutritional components from his food. But we can take it a step further once again. We can provide him with browser pellet and lots of different species of browse. We could pop it in different areas of the enclosure, and then that giraffe has the choice as to what species might be out there. It might be different every single day, so he's always excited to come out and see what species are available. He's going to experience different tastes of all the different species of tree. He's going to experience different behavioral opportunities with the way in which he might strip different leaves from different pieces of bark. So there's loads and loads, much more opportunity for him if we're able to give him all of these choices just within that one component of nutrition. Now, looking at enrichment provision as part of the behavior domain, we as keepers provide enrichment as part of the care that we give to our animals, but do we take the time to really assess whether these actions are having a positive impact on animal welfare or not? And by that, I don't just mean whether the animal interacted with it or not, because this is a massive mistake that I used to make in my own keeping career. I used to look at a piece of enrichment, say, great, the animal's playing around with it, job done. But actually, again, we now know that enrichment is so much more than that. And if we are looking at a pegboard like this for the snake, then this can promote behaviors such as climbing and investigation, which is fantastic. But if that snake has to physically be removed from its own environment in order to interact with this pegboard, then we're actually removing the choice and control that the snake has over its own environment. So that enriching experience might actually not be as enriching as we think because the snake has had no choice in the matter. Now, supplementing husbandry with input-based enrichment creates a situation where the care staff, rather than the animals, are exhibiting agency over their life experiences. And if we're examining the motivations behind the behaviors we want to encourage and creating opportunities for them, then it can provide much more effective enrichment experiences. Now, this again is another poll situation. So if we look at this video, which I'll start playing in a minute, I want to introduce you to something that I learned again from my past keeping. So as part of my care that I was providing for these dogfish, I gave them an enrichment ball. And hopefully you can all see that video. But my question for you is whether you think that this is actually promoting good welfare or not. So again, hopefully we can do this in the poll. And here comes the poll, although that seems to have stopped the video. There we go. Okay, so this is interesting. So we've got quite an interesting split. It's about 44% are saying they're not sure. Got about 39, approaching 40% saying yes, and we've got about 20% saying no. Now that's really, really interesting, again, with these results. And again, it's not a trick question. It's certainly a lesson that I learned in the past in my keeping career. Basically, I'm going to apologize because the next part of this talk has a lot of puns in it. I completely blame my husband for this, but on the surface of it, providing enrichment as part of care to encourage foraging seems great, okay? And that's what I was aiming for with this enrichment device. But if we dig a little deeper into how it's making the sharks feel, then they're not actually able to access the food that's inside that enrichment ball. They can interact with that ball as much as they like, but it's not actually coming out of there. And that can actually create a lot of frustration, a lot of feelings of frustration. And as soon as I realized that, I removed it and I gave them the food. But if I was judging that purely based on the care that I was providing, then I was providing enrichment. That's great care. That's perfect. But I might have missed how the sharks were coping with the conditions in which I presented them with. And I might have missed that frustration element. And I can't seem to move on. There we go. Okay, so when we conduct our daily checks and observations as part of our care routine, we are proactively rather than reactively reducing the potential for pain and suffering, which again is fantastic for welfare. But I wanted to take an example that is slightly different. If we look at a rhino on a really hot day, it might be part of a keeper's routine to apply mud to the skin of that rhino, which again is great, prevents biting flies, cools them down, all that kind of thing. But that's very much dependent on us as keepers being there and our time schedule rather than that of the rhino. If instead there's a mud wallow in the rhino's enclosure, then it's not dependent on us at all, or better yet, several mud wallows that the rhino can choose from. And then the rhino can respond to his motivational need to look after his skin and thermoregulate effectively by choosing to wallow whenever he likes, or by choosing those shady shelters that you can see in the picture. And that gives him that feeling of pleasure, and it gives him that sense of control and that choice and comfort, and most importantly, agency over his own healthcare. Now, us applying mud to the skin of the rhino could be deemed part of our care, but offering that rhino a choice of shady shelters and mud wallows, which they can choose to utilize whenever they like, that can contribute much more effectively to the overall welfare experienced by that rhino. And I also wanted to just share these thermo pictures that you can see in the bottom here, because it really does show how effective a mud wallow and a shady shelter is at keeping that rhino cool. And then when we're looking at environment, we talked about it earlier with the easy to clean, hyper clean enclosures, which meet our practical care needs as keepers rather than an animal's welfare needs. But enclosures also need to be species specific, and they need to provide opportunities for all the natural behaviors that that species has in their repertoire. And the provision of that environment is the care, and how the animal experiences and copes with that, with the conditions in which it lives, is the welfare. And you can see in these pictures, again, we've got two very extremes here. We've got fantastic welfare for the snake on the right. She's got the opportunity to climb, to investigate, to reach different thermo gradients and all that kind of thing. And sadly, this is actually on the left a picture that we took of a facility that we were working in Thailand. Thankfully, that snake is no longer in that situation. Now, our duty of care towards animals under our management extends beyond just the care that we provide. And an example of this is an animal that might feel scared. Now, as animal carers, we are keeping an animal safe from predators, from pests, from the public usually, and that is part of our role. But does the animal know that? And what we need to do in terms of welfare is we need to be making sure that the animal can feel safe in a way that makes sense to them. And that is very dependent on the species. So take Martha here, this capybara, an absolute babe of a capybara that I used to work with. She taught me a very valuable lesson about fear in animals. And that was when she was in a quarantine area. She was in quarantine in a stable, so it had a concrete floor, it had a lovely straw bed on one side, feeling nice and cozy for her, and somewhere that she could hide away in if she got scared, also, I thought. She also had her food trough, she had a water trough, and that was pretty much it. Now, the first day that I came in after she'd arrived, she was obviously very nervous. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know if I was a threat. She assumed I was. And what she did next really surprised me. And that was she decided, as I opened the door, to actually start to walk closer to me. And the reason that she did that was because I was stood next to her water trough. And she's obviously a semi-aquatic mammal, and out in the wild, if she gets scared, her first thought is to dive into water, and that is going to make her feel much safer. She can swim away from the threat. But so strong was her motivation to find water that she was actually choosing to come closer to that source of fear, which was me, in order to get to the water. And her water trough was only a few inches deep in water, and she eventually stood in it, and it only came up to just past her ankles. So it was a case of this was never going to make her any safer, and in fact it was bringing her closer towards that perceived threat. But actually she really did feel scared, and the way that made sense to her to feel safe and comforted was actually just to find water. So we need to make sure that we can meet an animal's needs versus our own expectations of what the animal might need. I made the mistake of seeing Martha like a giant guinea pig, and although she might look like that, we know that they do have very different species-specific needs. Now, welfare isn't as simple as good or bad. Yes, the animal has it. No, the animal doesn't. Instead, it exists on this sliding scale, and it's also a moving target, and that's impacted by the fluctuating conditions of daily life that we provide through our management and care. And we want to make sure that our animals have the opportunity to thrive rather than just survive through that care that we provide. And we want that to be evidenced not by our own emotions, not even necessarily through our own perceptions, but by actual welfare indicators. And using that 5 domains model, we might look at the behavior domain, and a positive welfare indicator from there might be play behavior, for example. And these can be objectively assessed in order for us to understand the way that the animal is coping and experiencing its life. Now, I want you guys to think a little bit more about motivation. So if you take a scenario, if you're feeling cold, for example, you have the agency to seek out extra clothes to put on, and then you put them on, you feel a lot more comfortable. If you're feeling hungry, you're able to satisfy that need by seeking out food, by preparing it and eating it. But for captive animals, if they're feeling cold but they've been shut out of their indoor enclosure, for example, or if they're feeling hungry but it's not yet the time in our routine to feed them, then those opportunities to meet their motivational needs have been limited. And so strong are those motivational needs, and just like the story with Martha the capybara, basically their motivation is to stay alive. It's the strongest motivational factor that we all have, and their motivation is always coming from that. If they're feeling cold in the wild, then they need to seek out shelter, otherwise they might die. If they're trying to find food, then they need to seek it out, otherwise they might die. They don't know that we are just next door preparing their food lovingly for them anyway. So if we can offer animals more opportunities to have more agency over their lives, as much as practically possible, of course, then we can really continue to drive forward the welfare that the animals experience. So being able to accurately and objectively assess welfare using evidence-based measures is essential to ensure a continuation of welfare improvements for animals under human care. And the way in which we assess welfare might traditionally be based around the completion of allocated management tasks. As I said before, have we scrubbed the walls to within an inch of their life? Do the straw beds look absolutely beautiful? But welfare assessments are entirely different entities to husbandry practices, and when considered separately, they can feed into an overall improvement in standards of care and welfare. Now, conducting comparative evaluations using a standard as a benchmark can really help to identify and prioritise potential gaps and opportunities in welfare. And that's something that Wild Welfare always states. We're not condemning anything, we're just looking for opportunities for improvement. And EAZA has actually recently launched their own Wild Welfare Assessment Guide, which Wild Welfare did help a little bit with. So do check that out, and maybe the team can put that in the chat because it's fantastic. Now, talking of other resources, another resource which Wild Welfare has created to provide information on both welfare and care is the Wild About Welfare Digital Education Programme. Again, if you want to check it out, then do scan that QR code on the left there. It is completely free to access. It's available in multiple languages. Currently, these are English and all Southeast Asian languages, but we are working on more at the time. All the time. And the idea is to introduce learners to the ways in which husbandry practices and animal welfare are reliant on each other. Now, for a lot of people, it might be a really great learning tool for kind of newer, greener keepers, and we are certainly seeing it utilised all the way around the world, which is fantastic. So in summary, care is what an animal receives via husbandry practices, whereas welfare is what the animal experiences as a result of that care. And we know that the activities which go into care might not necessarily equate to good welfare, but we also know that we make management decisions based on our knowledge of welfare. And the more that we do that, the more that we can have a significant impact on the animals under our care, helping them not just to survive, but to thrive. For anyone that wants a reference list, then here it is. If anyone does want to read further, we are very much an evidence-based organisation. We do base everything that we, all our training and all our resources on sound science. So it's a really important aspect to us. And if you do also want to read more, then do check out the Wild Welfare website for additional research and resources. I do also have to say a massive thank you to all of our supporters and donors. So we do have a lot of zoos supporting us, as you can see, and we do also have a lot of individual donors doing their own thing to help support us as well. And we could not do any of what we do without the support and the financial aid from these organisations. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who is here for listening. And of course, a massive thank you to the team at EAZA for inviting me to speak today. So if anyone does have any questions, do feel free to fling them my way, and hopefully I can try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a really great presentation. If anybody does have any questions, then please carry on sending them through on direct message or pop up a hand, and you can come on and chat to Sarah. I've got a question here. So you were talking about obviously the importance of moving from a shiny clean wool to other things that are possibly more meaningful for animals, but obviously there's a big thing there around public perception of a shiny clean wool, and especially kind of like a manager's feelings towards a public perception of a shiny clean wool. Have you got any advice, any kind of practical advice on how do we as an industry move away from that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of it lies in public education. I know a lot of people, we get scared by what the public is telling us, but actually maybe we should be looking at it the other way around. We should be telling the public, oh, if this area looks a little bit messy, it's just because they've just had some enrichment, or if this wall looks a little bit dirty, or whatever aspect that we're talking about, then there's a reason behind it, and we give the reason and we utilize it as an educational opportunity. And I've often found with the people that I've interacted with, they're really excited to learn a little bit more, behind the scenes of what we as keepers are actually trying to achieve. So that can be a great educational opportunity.
Amazing, thank you. I guess following on from that as well, have you got thoughts on how do we sort of persuade sort of directors, or what kind of conversations do we need to have to really, are there any particular positives that collections can use to sell that to them?
I think that's always a tricky one. I've never been a zoo director myself, so obviously they've got different priorities. They've got a lot of different stakeholders who they need to think about. But again, the way that wild welfare work is encouraging everyone to look through that lens of welfare first and foremost. And if we're able to do that, then I always find that everything else seems to fall into place. Because you're able to see the changes in the animal, and then the public notice that as well. They'll notice that reduction in abnormal behaviors. Hopefully they'll notice those extra elements. They'll know that they might stick around to watch an animal because it's acting much more naturally and interacting with its environment a lot more. So there's a lot of conversations that you can have with directors. Again, I know sometimes that is very much whether they're willing to listen. I really do think that we should all, every single one of us, but particularly directors, be battling against that phrase, we've always done it this way, because as we've seen, and as I've experienced things that we've always done when I was a younger keeper, I now realise how much our knowledge has changed. And if we do follow that route of we've always done it this way, then we're never going to progress. So I think it's really, really important to really question that, and to really put that welfare into that focal point, and everything else will then hopefully fall into place. I know it's difficult, but as I said, and as you said with my introduction, baby steps on this really do lead to big steps. And I've seen that all over the world with a lot of the facilities that I've worked with. If you just start with something small, and you can really then systematically drive things forward that way.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to just invite Ariana to ask a question now, if you want to unmute.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I have a question. But sometimes in an institution, an aquarium or a zoo, you have animals. Sometimes it's like people giving to you from like private people, and you don't have the space, and you cannot giving them the right, trimming, or they're just surviving. Maybe they're just a small enclosure. You try to give them to other institution, but you cannot find anyone. So when like euthanasia became an option, you think that it's something that it can be a choice, or we never do that, or sometimes it's it's heartbreaking to just see them leaving bed, and we can think about something that I don't know. It's
I know what you mean, and I've had this conversation a lot recently, particularly with rescue centres. I work with a lot out in Southeast Asia, and they have similar decisions to make. Are they able to take in another animal? Are they able to ensure its welfare? But obviously there's a need there. They are fulfilling that need, just like you guys are doing with those situations. So I think a really important aspect is a quality of life assessment. Are we able to provide the animal with a decent quality of life, and then we can always work on improving that. But it is a very, very difficult thing. Obviously, resources are very finite, and it's a very difficult decision to make. But definitely quality of life assessments. And then with euthanasia, again, it's a very, very difficult decision to make. But sometimes it might actually be the right one, because yeah, once an animal is euthanized, it's not actually a welfare issue. That we're alleviating the suffering there. It's very difficult to say that, but it is also a question of what do we do in the interim? We don't want this animal to suffer. So it's that questioning of how we can alleviate that. But it's a very difficult one.
Yeah, I know. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Another question here. When you talked about being able to create agency for animals on their timeframes for things like feeding opportunities, have you got some ideas for what are practical ways to do that?
Yeah, you guys are giving me all the questions. So I've seen quite a few automatic feeders. I know I've never actually used any myself, but I know there can sometimes be problems with them, but sometimes automatic feeders can work to your advantage. You can also just have more elements of their diet which are much more ad lib, like access to hay or browse, and things like that. But yeah, it's a difficult one to be able to give them full agency. So you can't give them the keys to their own enclosure kind of thing, but there are other ways that you can give agency, and a lot of that is through choice. So I always refer back to this because it is an excellent teaching opportunity. If we think about when we were in lockdown during COVID, we had our choices removed, and even though we still had plenty of things to occupy us, we still felt frustrated, we still felt confined essentially, and we really wanted to be able to have more choice over our lives. We didn't like people telling us we couldn't go somewhere, and that kind of thing. So if we are able to give the animals under our care more choices to choose from, and more ways in which they can interact with their enclosure, with their humans, with any elements of their life in the way that they want to, that's the way in which we can make sure that we give them that agency. And it's such a critical thing to be able to achieve. Sorry, I've got lots of things popping up on my screen. Yeah, so giving an animal agency, we can mainly achieve that through the choices that we give them. I've got some great videos on this, which really do show that motivation as well. So we were talking about those strong motivations. So a video that I've got that I use quite a lot is there's a bear that we helped to rehome into a new area. He had slept next to his brother every single day of his life in this museum in Japan where he was living, but he was always separated by bars. For the first time, he actually had a straw bed to sleep in, but he wanted to sleep next to his brother because that's what he'd always done. So the door was open, he could sleep next to his brother, but he wanted his straw bed for comfort. So there's this video of him determinedly taking absolutely every single last little piece of straw into this area next to his brother so that he could sleep where he wanted to. And again, it's such a simple little thing, but again, it's giving them agency. And again, with the whole shutting indoor and outdoor of enclosures, bears. There's some brilliant studies done on several bear species. Again, sorry, I talk about bears a lot, but there's some great studies that show that having that choice is actually more important than using it. So if you've got a director saying, oh, well, we have to shut them out so that they can be seen by the public, there's actually a brilliant study that showed that polar bears who were pacing next to their shut enclosure door, they actually significantly reduced their pacing once the door was lifted, and they had choice, they had agency of where they wanted to be, but they actually only used their indoor area 2% of the time. So having that choice is much more important than using that choice, but having that available to them, that gives them the agency. Can you link that study if possible? I can't right now, but I can certainly send some studies later on. I'm not sure if that one is in my reference list, but there are some others. Oh, and I think
Sal might have done it.
Brilliant, thank you.
Amazing, thank you. Another question here. Sorry, we're already putting you through the mill. How do you propose we interact with the public in zoos that perceive our animals' welfare as poor? This person saying that on multiple occasions they've had visitors saying they should brush the animal's teeth, which in this case was in fact a rhino. How do you think we should turn this into an opportunity for education?
The public. Yes. So again, really great educational opportunity, and sometimes these are much more one-on-one. So we might say to that person that's come up to say, why don't you brush their teeth? You might be able to just take the time to really explain. But also, I think within this digital world, there's real opportunities here to make something like, you could actually make a video that goes out on the zoo socials and say, okay, so we are here with our rhino keeper, and someone asked us recently, why don't we brush their teeth? And we're going to explain why. We're going to link it all into welfare, and it really makes everybody who is following that zoo actually realize that this isn't just about all the babies that the zoo's producing. This isn't about X, Y, and Z. This is actually about the individual animals sometimes, which I know the public love to hear about, but also the welfare that they need. And let's trust the keepers because they do know what they're talking about, and let's understand together why we might not necessarily brush a rhino's teeth. And then also we can always link it back to us. I know a lot of the public, they really struggle with things that if it makes sense for us, why doesn't it make sense for other animals? So a conversation I have a lot is the chimpanzee is smiling, therefore it's happy, and we obviously all know the whole 𝗕𝗲 situation. So again, these educational opportunities, you can have them in the zoo itself, but you can also take them onto that digital platform, and you can use loads of different ways to educate the public and show what science is backing this up as well. Because I've had a lot of conversations with people, and again, they think they know best, but if you're able to actually say, well, here's the paper that actually states this, and let's read through it together. I know we don't always have time for that kind of thing, but there's lots of opportunities there, and it can be quite fun, yeah, it can also obviously be quite stressful sometimes.
Awesome, thanks, Sarah. We've got a comment, not a question, from Tony. If you want to come on, Tony.
Hello.
Hi, Tony.
You can hear me well enough?
Yes.
Really interesting presentation, by the way, very enlightening in many ways. And one of the things that I was really encouraged by was your comment about the 5 freedoms as opposed to the 5 domains. I'm a little older than most, so I'm a lot more familiar with the 5 freedoms. And I always personally had a problem with the promoting natural behavior aspect of the 5 freedoms. You probably saw from my avatar, I'm more reptile experienced than anything else. And there are certain natural behaviors in reptiles that we certainly wouldn't want to embrace in captivity. Things such as male combat, live feeding of prey, freedom to breed at will. These are all things that we wouldn't promote in captivity, or at least not excessively. And all keepers will actively curate the natural behaviors that we think are beneficial or welfare centric. And so it's very interesting to know that the 5 domains will hopefully address that worry that I've had for a while. Can you explain to me a little how that would correlate, how the 5 domains would alleviate my worry about having to promote all natural behaviors?
That is an excellent question. I think one thing that sprang to mind for me is my university dissertation was actually looking at the natural behavioural repertoire as a whole. And I actually did it on wolves. I'm not particularly reptile-y, sadly, but I was looking at what opportunities each of the individuals that I was studying had to undertake each behaviour, whether we saw it, whether we didn't, but also whether they had the opportunity to or not. So it might be a case that you might look at the natural behavioural repertoire, if you can find one for each of the wild species of reptile that you're talking about, and see whether they have the opportunity to display all of these as much as possible. Now, there are obviously restrictions, as you said, with breeding, with live feeding and that kind of thing. I've certainly seen some quite inventive ways of feeding reptiles in ways that obviously it's not live, but it is still able to promote some of those natural behaviors. So for Komodo dragons, for example, I've seen the scent marks and then an anchor of the, and you might do this yourself, not live feeding, but the food that's anchored in, and then they still have to go through those processes of ripping and tearing and all that kind of thing. So you might actually already be doing more than you think, but if you're able to just take the idea and look into each behavior that you might expect to see and see what's limited and see what doesn't have to be limited. Obviously, there are always limitations within a captive environment that we do need to try and address where we can. But if there are those opportunities there, then that's all we can do at the moment in terms of moving towards welfare.
It is, and I think my experience is largely with keepers rather than zookeepers, with private keepers, and there is an ultra advancement lobby that want to make sure that every enclosure is the size of a room, that every animal has a massage and bark play to it because this might be beneficial. And I think there are practical considerations for anybody who keeps animals, and especially private keepers. My dog likes to roll in fox poo. Is it a necessity for me to provide this opportunity for him because he would prefer to do this? We have preference testing to tell us that he would like to do this. Is it necessary for us to provide that activity to say that we're rubber stamping good welfare? And I don't think so. I think there's a measure to it and there's a balance. Like you say, we balance it with the public's perception. We balance it with the business of zoo directors. We balance it with our practical capabilities in captivity. And I think I need to spend a little bit of time looking at those 5 domains and working in the direction you mentioned, which is to promote them as much as we can within our constraints, within our practical ability.
And you can also look at the species specificity of each of those species that you're talking about. So if you're saying bark chip for every single species, a sand burrowing animal might have a problem with that. But I know with a lot of private keepers, there's been a lot of question marks around rectilinear posturing in snakes and the ability to do that. And it's again, if we're able to back it up with science, so I think that there's a little bit more discussion around even just whether reptiles have the same welfare needs as other animals and that kind of thing. So there's the scientific papers coming out about all of this all of the time, and if we keep ourselves up to date with all of that and we're able to say, well, this is what the science says, let's follow this, then it's always a great way to back ourselves up that way. But I know it can be a contentious subject sometimes.
It is rather, and I don't want to take up any more of your time because I could talk about this all day, of course, but thank you very much. It's been very very helpful and enlightening. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for your comments, Tony.
Thanks so much, Tony. Got a couple more questions. I'm hoping we can fit them both in, Sarah. First question here is, so if we're looking at welfare and human-animal interactions, how should you sort of think about this in terms of influencing, in terms of organising keeper teams? So recognising that obviously different keepers are going to have different interactions with animals. Larger zoos have got large teams that are organised into sections, and then smaller zoos have got small keeper teams with keepers working on multiple sections. And then do you think is there a particularly good way to kind of evaluate what's the best organisation in terms of welfare for species? Do you think it's going to vary per species, per individual? I think that captures the question.
Wow. Okay. As I say, I haven't been a zoo director, curator type level person, so it would be very difficult for me to state which way is best. I'd say in terms of animal welfare, again, it depends on that individual experience, which I know we were talking a lot about in the welfare forum. So if you've got a very neophobic individual, for example, then maybe you'll start them off with just one keeper that they feel comfortable with and gradually introduce more and more keepers in that very positive way. Again, that animal has the option to move away should they want to, and they feel in control of the situation and that introduction of new keepers. But you do also want that little bit of kind of flexibility. You can't just have that single keeper, particularly if they're on a day off. And if they're not there, then the animal might have a miserable day. You definitely don't want that. So you want to introduce that level of flexibility within the animal. But I think consistency can sometimes be a real boon within a keeper team. And I know the larger the team, the harder it is. But if you go into your record keeping, into your communication within your team and making sure that you are consistent. So if you've got 3 different people training an animal, making sure that that training is consistent, otherwise it's going to cause frustration in the animal. If you've got a level of predictability you obviously don't want a routine to be so inflexible and the animal to start to have all of those types of problems with experiencing, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word, can't think of it, but yeah, anticipation, there we go. Oh gosh, yes. So if they're anticipating certain aspects to your routine, you don't want that either. But if you're able to offer that animal that level of understanding, and again, it's something I spoke about in Italy, just giving them time to adjust to, if there is a new keeper who they don't know very well, if they don't know they can trust them, if we need them to shift on and off exhibit and we're running behind, but it's up to their schedule, giving them time, allowing them to really just sit and figure things out for themselves, because they do ponder, they've got cognitive abilities. Let's give them the chance to use them. But in terms of teams, there's always going to be people that they do and don't like. But as I said, with that example from Italy, it was, you can actually change that. And as long as you're not forcing it, as long as you are using PRT and you're using ways in which the animal feels comfortable and the keeper feels comfortable, you can actually work towards slightly more positive interactions and much more understanding between both the animal and the keeper. I hope that answers some of that question.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. And we'll just squeeze one more in. Excuse the pronunciation, but 𝗕liche, if you want to come on and ask your question. Excuse my pronunciation.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
I've got a question. I work with domestic animals, and I am really interested in better welfare for this kind of animals. We have cows, sheep, and and I'm really not sure what I can do more for them, because it's domestic animals and we really try. We have them on pastures and then, but
Well, without knowing the setup, it's difficult to make suggestions, but there's definitely always this very similar things that you can do for domestics as you can do for exotics, to use want of a better term. So I used to always give, I'm a massive guinea pig fan, so I used to give my pet guinea pigs enrichment in the same way that I'd give my zoo animals enrichment. And even just looking out at your different pastures and making sure that everybody has a choice of shelters. Maybe they've got other things that they want to experience. So I've seen a lot of great videos with abilities to scratch and having those scratching machines and things like that. So there's lots of different things you can look at, but if you start to view what you've got in front of you through that lens of welfare, and you're able to look and think, what opportunities do these animals have, and how can I create more opportunities for them in what they might want? And there'll be loads of papers on domestics about still what behaviors that they might want to achieve, and you can look at their wild counterparts. What does a 𝗕𝗃 versus a guinea pig do in the wild? What does a wild species of cow do in the wild, and how can we compare that to domestics? And you can really kind of see that as the starting point, the inspiration point maybe, to what opportunities you can give them. But again, even if we're looking at nutrition, you might give them a complete feed, but are they actually able to then graze at the same time or browse, whatever species we're talking about? And are there opportunities that way? So there's lots of different things you can do, even just different substrates that they might want to choose to be able to walk on. And sometimes it seems like really incremental little changes, but it can mean so much to that animal. The more that we're able to just give them those, be able to meet their needs essentially, and their needs instead of what we need.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to have to wrap up because we're bang on time. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody for coming. Just a little reminder that Sal's put a bunch of links in the chat today. She's been on fire. There is now available on the EAZA website how to develop your animal welfare assessment program guidelines. And Sarah mentioned those, and Salah's actually popped the link in the chat for those as well. So if anybody wants those, then please do follow those links. And Sarah, there are a couple of questions that we just couldn't get to. If people have got those, is it okay for them to contact you via email after this?
Absolutely, yeah. My email is sarah@𝗦welfare.org, so feel free to ping them over and I'll try and get to them.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks everyone for listening. Bye.